Hey everybody, welcome back to the Planet Coaster Ski Resort, a series that I'm still kind of surprised a decently sizable section of my audience wants to watch at all, but honestly, I'm very glad because I want to do this thing and some people are into it, so hey, that's pretty nice. Today's episode is all about building a restaurant, although not quite in the location that some of you have been recommending me. I've seen some comments of people recommending to build a restaurant on top of the mountain, as well as down in the valley to create a sort of village in the valley, but to be honest, all the way since the beginning I've been planning to have a restaurant on this section kind of halfway down the mountain with a view over the different hills, which is something that, at least in my experience in Austria, when the slopes are located on places that are usually farms in summer, you get all of these houses around the slopes as well, and every now and then you'll have a restaurant down the middle of the mountain as well. With usually a nice area in front of it for, well, be it après ski or just in general sitting in the sun, which is surprisingly nice, honestly, in even the cold, harsh weather of a ski resort, especially when you're clothed in all of your skiing outfits. It can actually be quite nice to just sit in the sun for a while, so this is going to be one of those terraces, I'd say. And there's not really a particular inspiration to this. But on the last video, somebody commented recommending me a specific restaurant that's located on the Hohe Salve mountain in Austria, which I thought was super interesting because it's actually a place that I've been to myself. And while these kinds of restaurants are super awesome right on the peak of a mountain, I don't think I really have the space for it on either of the peaks on this map. So this location is the next best thing, I figured as well. So here I'm just kind of shaping out what the terrace in front of the building is going to be like. So we have this sort of man-made structure of wood and stone sticking out to provide this straight plateau which the terrace can be built on. And just behind that I'm going to build the building itself. And before I get into that, into the build, if you will, something that's kind of interesting about this build, I think, is that I'm taking a slightly different approach when it comes to building it, because the architecture is going to be very similar to what I've done on this series before, but also on Jägerhorn. I'm still generally following the architecture of Swiss chalet style architecture, so lots of wooden beams, large overhanging roofs with very big eaves, and things like this. I'll definitely get into the specifics in a minute because I'm gonna start building any second now, but it's something to consider. I wanted to add a little bit of variation, at least in terms of how these videos go. So for today's build, I'm gonna try to build this building more in a sense that you would usually see them built in real life, to really try and replicate the wooden frames. So before I build the building itself, I'm going to build the structural foundation which everything is going to rest on. So I'm starting out with a bunch of woodwork. This little bit of wall here is really only to shape out the size and composition of the building as it's eventually going to be. But I'm just gonna stick to woodwork for the rest of it. And when it comes to the actual structure, this is something which I've honestly never actually looked into. But I did for this video because I was always curious if there were specific terms for this, because I've always based my wooden structural work on real life structures, but never really knew too much about the terminology of it. So this type of structure is apparently called a king post roof, given the fact that you have a horizontal tie beam between the diagonal struts, and then in the middle of that tie beam you have a vertical beam going down the middle of the gabled roof. And this is what is apparently called a king post. And just next to that you have two diagonal cross ties as well, some struts connecting to the roof. But this is just one of the many different structures that you can support such a wooden roof with. There are different sort of shapes for it as well, which I've definitely gotten into with some of my builds. But this is probably the most simple one and the most common one. Some other alternatives have definitely popped up throughout Jägerhorn, but that's too much detail for me to go into right now. Anyway, I thought it was interesting because it's definitely not the first time that I've built this kind of roof, but it's the first time that I've learned that apparently it has a very specific name that I wasn't aware of. Now, on top of these, this horizontal tie beam and the vertical king post are a big row of very densely packed rafters, or also known as top cords, which are all of these wooden beams that the roof itself is going to lie directly on, and then right in the middle on top of the roof is a ridge board, as opposed to having a roof tile ridge or something like this. So it's all wood and it's all almost exactly the same beam, but by placing it in different directions and connecting it in different ways, I think you can honestly create quite a well-shaped wooden basic structure for any building in Planet Coaster. And honestly, it's kind of something that I miss in Planet Zoo as well, because going back to Planet Coaster, even though there are so many downsides to it, Planet Zoo is difficult to come back from because the graphics and everything just looks so much better, and the game is honestly very well optimized compared to Planet Coaster as well. But at the same time, Planet Coaster has all these different wooden textures that allow you to make so many combinations that really give a lot of detail and nuance to wooden buildings, which I think is why I like building wooden buildings so much in Planet Coaster, because there's just so much variety when it comes to it. And there's just so many items that you can use here. Anyway, after that sort of main section of the building is complete, that is, by the way, not what the roof is going to look like, but this is really sort of just the structure underneath, and I'll place the actual roof tiles or shingles on top of this later. But yeah, after that whole section is done, I decided to add one wing of the building and also some big cross beams alongside the roof as well, which is a bit overdoing it. I'm gonna be honest, this is way too much wood. I honestly could have been fine with the structure as it was, but I just find that these beams underneath the roof, holding up these large eaves that overhang the building and give enough space for the balcony underneath it as well, these are just such a typical characteristic touch of Alpine architecture in Europe that I really wanted to feature something like that as well. But then, of course, also a big balcony right underneath it to create this very inviting entrance, I hope. Or at least, I hope it's inviting. That was the idea behind building it like this anyway. And that is really going to be the main section of the building where most of the weight is going to be. And I'm just going to build some asymmetrical wings on both sides, a little bit lower, just the ground floor, to round off the entire restaurant layout. Now, you can probably say at this point, but Sylv, why are you doing all of this? I mean, you're not even going to see the majority of these beams. Why would you even build all of them? Isn't that kind of a waste of the game's... well, actually, I'm definitely sacrificing the game performance here as well. But yeah, I kind of agree, it's a little bit pointless, but for some reason, just the idea that underneath this building is an actual realistic roof support structure just kind of makes it feel a bit more real. It's also fun to just build it. Gotta be honest, I kind of did this more for the process than the actual final result. But even then, I think it makes sense when it comes to the detailing, because on the edge of the roof you can see all of the different rafters sticking out and showing that there is some kind of wooden, support structure inside the building. In the front you can see all of the gable pieces coming together and reflecting the structure of the entire building. So all in all, I think it makes the whole building a bit more believable. It just forces me to place all the beams in a way that would make sense, and not just as a detailing method in hindsight. Because normally what I do is just build buildings that aren't really structurally sound and add all of these wooden things as details after I'm done placing the walls and the roof itself, which works more or less. But this method of doing things is a tiny bit more realistic, although it takes a lot more effort at the end of the day. And in a similar sense, I really like building walls not out of wall pieces, but out of these window pieces, and I'm honestly so glad that Frontier decided to add actual plaster pieces to Planet Zoo, because it makes a huge difference in terms of how easy it is to, make custom walls like this. But at the end of the day, for the texture, it doesn't actually matter that much, because these window pieces are perfect for plaster. And some people even build entire builds out of it. I'm thinking of Taliko by Free the Bear and Advo TV right here. Also known as Sean McBeard nowadays. By the way, this is the most random shout out of all time, but I'm gonna just link that series in the description because it's absolutely amazing. but it's still not continued. They've been working on it for years, and I think the project is a little bit dead at the moment, but it's one of my all-time favorite Planet Coaster builds. It's really amazing, and maybe, but this is a very big maybe, I could get Free the Bear to give me the park file at some point and see if there's anything I can do with it. But yeah, that's all just very far future kind of assumptions. Anyway, Taliko is amazing, and it's a big inspiration, and I think it was one of the forerunners in this whole creating walls out of window pieces thing that people like to do in Planet Coaster. Although, of course, Taliko took it way too far. I'm only just using the walls here and there where the in-game walls, don't really work out. Then I'll resort to a few window pieces, but in Taliko's case, I think almost all of the buildings are entirely made out of it. But it's cool. It definitely allows for a lot of flexibility and different shapes and sizes and such. Now, what you might also notice about this building is that I'm using these window pieces to create really big windows on the building itself, just because I feel like, just like the building in the valley, the après-ski building, this is also a rather recent construction. It's just built in a very traditional style to fit with the ski resort and just, well, look attractive. There's no reason that a new building can't be built in an older style, of course. But yeah, given the fact that the windows and everything are so large, it's definitely quite a modern influenced building as well. Or contemporary, I should say. It's always interesting to kind of come back to this discussion of whether you should build modern things or modern architecture or traditional architecture. And I'm using modern here in the sort of wide sense of, newer styles that break away from vernacular architecture. But at the end of the day, I think there's a right time and place for either of them, and personally I just really like the aesthetic of restaurants like this having traditional architecture, especially since traditional European Swiss chalet style architecture is very over the top. It's very sort of bringing back older architectural style, so it's actually not really that authentic, but it's just a fun sort of very ridiculously detailed, kind of cheesy, kitschy, but wholesome architectural style that I think is great for this kind of thing. But then when it comes to ski lift stations or things like that, I honestly really love contemporary architecture as well. For me personally, there's a right time and place and context for everything, and especially when it comes to architecture, context for me is key. There's not really for me such a thing as good or bad architecture per se, and you'd really just have to look at every building in terms of what its surrounding is like, what the function of it is, etc. Sorry if that got a little bit too political, but I don't know. I guess it's vaguely relevant to what I'm building here. By the way, I have to say, I'm not actually going to do any interiors on this. I'm already famously bad at doing interiors, and maybe at some point in the future I could work on the insides of this building, but for now I would rather spend my time on finishing the rest of the ski resort and, spending my time on other things than just being stuck to this one building here. Now, there came a time in the time-lapse here where I wasn't really sure what to do every now and then, so there are some cuts here, just me figuring out what my next steps were going to be. But soon enough, I realized that if I want this thing to actually look realistic and look like an actual restaurant in a ski resort, it has to have a bunch of mess around it, so there are some big racks with skis in it that honestly I just stole from the après-ski bar in the valley of the mountain, and some picnic tables right in front of this building, just to make sure that, people can actually sit down in front of it as well. And for a while I've been considering whether I want to add parasols to this terrace as well. I'm still not sure, because I think realistically it's something that you might see, but then again, I do like the view of the building that you have right now as well, so for the time being, I'm gonna keep them open like this, but I may very well add parasols to them at some point. But then again, I'm also just kind of thinking, it's a ski resort, and if anything, you want to sit in the sun whenever it's sunny, so it doesn't really make sense in this kind of context, and it's something that while I do see it in real life, I would personally just always go for a sunny spot if I'm gonna sit outside at all. But then again, I am totally an indoor eater when it comes to skiing. I don't know, I think everybody has their kind of preferences for this, but personally I always like warming up indoors and taking off all of my heavy skiing clothes and just relaxing like that. And before I forgot, because I almost did, I decided to add some snow on top of the roof as well, because realistically there is snow on top of the roofs throughout this build, and there's snow on the trees as well. So a small layer of snow is of course something that I should add here. And before I finish this episode, there was one more thing that I wanted to do, and that is work on the detailing of the Poma lift here, or as I called it in the last episode, the button lift. There was a little bit of confusion about that in the comments because I didn't really go too much into detail when it comes to what these things are like, but it's basically just a round disc of rubber at the end of a stick, and that's why it's called a button, because it kind of looks like a button. You stick that thing between your butts. I've talked about this enough, it's getting a bit weird. You know, the whole like sticking rubber things up your butt thing, but you know, that's how you go up a mountain in this case. Anyway, that's the lift. I'm gonna refer to it as a Poma lift in the future, I guess, because it really is specifically a lift by the manufacturer Poma. But anyway, I wanted to add a bit of detailing to this, add a small fence to protect the people on the lift from the people outside the lift who might crash into them. You never know, it's not actually that important and you don't always see it in real life, but it's something I figured was worth adding. And also, before I finish that, I wanted to add a small cabin just for whoever's operating the lifts, and I'm not sure what it's like for these kind of lifts. I've never actually been on a Poma lift myself. All of the similar lifts that I've been on were by the manufacturer Doppelmayr, which is the same manufacturer for the gondolas and chairlifts that we have in the game, at least judging by what they look like. But yeah, I don't know if this manufacturer usually adds their sort of cabins, their operator huts on the top or the bottom of the lift. But in this case, I just decided to add it up here because I felt it would look a bit better. And for the style of this building, I'm basically creating the same king post roofs, but then on a smaller scale. So it's very similar to the restaurant building, but just a tiny version of it, basically. And once again, I kind of feel I didn't really need to go that far, but at this point I just had too much fun with these things. I'm not sure if you can expect me to go back to this method of doing roofs. I'm probably going to scale it down a little bit, but it's good to have it in mind and know what the actual structure of a roof is like, because it can really help to make your roofs look better, more realistic and more detailed. So for anyone who's interested, I'm also going to link, honestly, whatever kind of resource I can find down in the description about these kinds of roofs, so you can learn and teach yourself about how to build cool wooden roofs. Anyway, that is just about it for this episode, so I'd like to thank you guys for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. I have no idea what I'm going to be doing, but it'll probably be something skiing related. Bye guys!